So, hi everyone, welcome. I'm Ben Kelly, along with Miriam Fine and Ola Ozanov-Palchik. I'm one of the co-founders of the Brookline Literacy Coalition. Um, and, the three of us have been working together along with others for a number of years. And we started this organization formally this year because we felt it was really important to advocate for science and evidence-based literacy instruction in Brookline. And so we've had a few events so far, and tonight we're really happy and honored to have Nancy Nelson here. I'll leave the introductions to Ola, who will introduce Nancy in just a few minutes. And I'll be brief in just saying thank you everybody for attending. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. And now Miriam is gonna talk to you for a couple minutes.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. I just wanted to note that the topic that we'll hear about today is particularly relevant and on people's minds in Brookline, as it is in many other districts. But Brookline was recently cited by the state as having disproportionality in the students who are identified for special education. So my understanding is that we have certain groups of students, particularly racial groups, that are disproportionately identified as having a learning disability, and that includes in reading. And so as a result of that finding, the Brookline School District recently commissioned a review of the systems of support and response to intervention, not only in reading and in math as well, and behavior. And so, there were various findings. It was recently discussed at the school committee meeting, and all kinds of interesting questions came up. So, one of them was the need for coherence, a lot more coherence across the schools in the district. And there were questions about the instruction and the curriculum and what it means is the tiers, and is one of the tiers special education or not. And so I think that this presentation will be particularly interesting. I'm really looking forward to it and illuminating. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Dr. Nelson. I'll let Ola give some information about an introduction.
Hello, everyone. So Dr. Nancy Nelson is a colleague. She's an assistant professor of special education in the Willock College of Education and Human Development at Boston University. Dr. Nelson has been a PI or co-PI on more than a dozen federally funded projects to develop or test the efficacy of math and reading interventions for students with or at risk for learning disabilities. She is an author of several curricular and multiple publications, over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, and she presented in over 100 national and international conferences. She is also a co-director of the National Center for Improving Literacy, NCIL, and we are very, very lucky to have her here to speak about how to improve reading development within the MTSS framework. And one thing I want to mention is that you can pose your questions during her talk in a chat, and then we'll present them. There will be several points throughout her talk where we can present the questions. And then at the end, we will have about 25 minutes for Q&A, where you can just unmute yourself and we can have a discussion. So thank you very much. And yeah, looking forward.
Thanks, Ola, and thanks, Ola. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen and start sharing some presentation slides to give you some information about this wonderful topic for all of you. Go into slide mode here. And just make sure you can see my slides currently, correct? Yes, perfect. All right, so I've already gotten a fantastic introduction. I do want to note I am new to the Boston community. I was at the University of Oregon for about a decade prior to coming to Boston University, and I'm thrilled to be part of this community, working with all of you more locally to address these issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about what the features of multi-tiered systems of support for literacy should look like, what those tiers of support look like, and then I'm going to give you a case example of something called enhanced core reading instruction that is an evidence-based systematic literacy intervention that really focuses on supporting the quality and efficacy of reading instruction across those tiers of support. So essential features of multi-tiered systems. What are these systems of support that we're talking about? I'm sorry, I'm having some slide issues. Sorry. So for MTSS implementation, why do we focus on multi-tiered systems of support? Well, there are multiple reasons, but primarily because these MTSS systems, these multi-tiered systems of support, really focus on supporting all students and each individual student within this system. MTSS is not synonymous with response to intervention, but they have a lot of overlap in that response to intervention is sort of the initial underpinnings of one arm of an MTSS approach that really focuses on academic intervention and support. And it's also been established in federal law. So it's part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that is used as part of an approach for identifying students as eligible for special education under the category of specific learning disability. And in this sort of broad systems approach, whether you're talking about RTI or whether you're talking about MTSS, we really want to use this system as a prevention-oriented approach. And so in that context, it has the potential to eliminate or at least substantially reduce the use of a wait to fail approach, where typically or prior to RTI being indicated in IDEA in sort of 2004, students were only found eligible for special education after they had demonstrated a significant gap between their performance and their peers' performance. And there wasn't any sort of prevention-oriented focus on trying to make sure students were getting that support that they needed prior to falling behind. And so this approach, whether you call it RTI or MTSS, is really a way of being able to intervene early on, use data to inform instruction and intervention, and ensure that students are getting what they need before they fall behind. MTSS or RTI also promotes flexible access to intervention. So the way that these systems are set up is that students are not assigned to special education or general education. It's really that students are flexibly assigned to tiers of support that are intended to provide immediate access for the student to what they need, where students can flow between those tiers of support flexibly as data indicate need for them to do so. A very important point about MTSS and RTI is that when we're implementing this, we really need to use evidence-based practices across tiers of support, across instruction, intervention, for our assessments to make the best use of limited resources in school systems, because that is true for all school systems, no matter which school district you're talking about, to make sure we're bridging the research to practice gap and really taking advantage of the research findings that we are accruing in large studies with diverse populations to implement the science of reading, and to make sure that we really maximize equity in education to give all students access to the services that they deserve. So many of you, if you're familiar with MTSS or RTI, have probably seen this ubiquitous triangle where we have sort of, tier 1 at the bottom, all students are receiving tier 1. In literacy, we call this core reading instruction. Tier 2 supports are considered supplemental intervention. That's sort of the yellowish area where we're talking about supports that are intended to be additive. So students are getting those supports above and beyond tier 1 core instruction when they demonstrate need for receiving that sort of support on the basis of initial screening assessments. And then they receive progress monitoring as part of that tier of support to make sure that that support is actually meeting their needs, and that there can be instructional adjustments within and across time to support their access to the support that is intended for them. And then if they're not making a progress in that tier of support with tier 1 and tier 2, we potentially move them to a tier 3 level of support, which is more intensive intervention. That's really designed, again, for students who don't respond to effective tier 1 and tier 2 support, or for students that are substantially far behind their peers. Again, all of these tiers are intended to be implemented flexibly. We want to see the majority of our students benefiting from our tier 1 support. So we expect that about 80% of students will be able to benefit from that level of support. And if they're not, that tells us that our tier 1 instruction is not good enough, and we need to use our data to refine that tier 1 support and research evidence to make sure that that tier 1 is truly benefiting the majority of our students. We expect that tier 2 should be designed for about 15% of the population, and then tier 3 support should be designed for about 5% of the population. And again, this is not synonymous with special education. So we really think of MTSS as a general education function where special education could be provided in conjunction with any tier of support, and really whether or not a particular tier might correspond with special education specifically is more a question of the resources that are required within the school system to provide the support that the student needs. So if those can be provided in general education, it's all general education. If they can't be, and the student demonstrates substantive need, then that warrants special education specifically. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I just want to highlight a couple of things about MTSS, because a lot of times, even for people that are very familiar with multi-tiered systems of support in RTI, we tend to maybe use shorthand language or think about these systems as really focused on only instruction, intervention, and assessment. And there are really a lot of other things that need to be considered as we think about whether or not we're actually implementing MTSS or RTI, which includes making sure that we're using the data that we're collecting, and we're using those data in the ways that they were intended to be used, that we're making sure that we're using assessments that are technically adequate, that we're dedicating sufficient time for instructional support, that there's an instructional leadership engaged in implementation, that there's professional development and coaching to support implementation toward goals that we've sort of established and are all agreeing on, that we're focusing on these evidence-based practices and essential elements of literacy using effective instructional delivery features, and that we're differentiating support. And so there really are multiple facets of these systems that need to be considered for us to say legitimately, we are collectively implementing MTSS or RTI in an evidence-based way. So I'll pause there actually, and just because I'm going to start talking about literacy instruction across those tiers and what literacy instruction should look like within each of those tiers. But I want to see if there are any questions about MTSS broadly or RTI broadly, knowing that Brookline has recently adopted a plan related to implementing RTI.
I didn't see any questions in the chat, but I guess the question I had is, when you come to a school district, to start sort of implementing MTSS, what are the major weaknesses that you usually see across those different components? Is it the curriculum itself? Is it, time devoted? Yeah, so if you could just, I don't know if you have any later on, but.
No, that's a great question. I think it's all over the map. I mean, sometimes we see that the amount of time dedicated to literacy instruction it's not protected, and there's not time for intervention within the system. So there, with the best intentions, often school districts have mandated certain approaches or certain things that have to happen for certain students in a certain way. And that sometimes runs counter to the principles of MTSS, so that the broad concept of providing something more to students is there, but how it happens is not aligned with the way that MTSS needs to work. Or we see sort of duplicated systems where there's sort of a response to intervention system that's used for special education eligibility decision-making, and a separate system that's used for MTSS sort of implementing literacy instruction, and well, usually instruction and not intervention. Another thing we see is use of a lot of different assessments that run counter to each other, or not consistent use, where you can't compare data sources over time, which becomes problematic. And then the other thing I think that we see, well, leadership, also huge. So sometimes we'll have teachers on board and not a lot of leadership support from either the district or school leader at the school level, or vice versa. And then the other big one is curriculum. So the curricula, and this is very, very true across Massachusetts, I found, not unlike Oregon, but there are a lot of districts that have historically used reading instructional programs in their tier 1 instruction that are not teaching the most important literacy skills, which is actually, I will talk quite a bit about that.
guess I have one more question.
Mhm.
Again, I'm sorry if you're planning to address
No,
it.
it's great.
What do you find to be like the lowest hanging fruit in terms of like minimum intervention, again, from your perspective, when you're entering a new school, and maximum improvement? Is it,
Yeah.
the assessment? Is it the intervention? Is it, I don't know, coaching? Like, what is the...
Yeah, I mean, it does depend on the system. I would say that it's one of three things usually. And so the easiest thing to do, it doesn't have the biggest benefit for students, but the easiest thing to do to start getting on board with implementing MTSS is to implement a screening and progress monitoring system. So you're collecting the data, you're looking at the data, and you start to understand this is who is in our district. These are the weaknesses of our population in terms of what they need. And that's what you have from there, right? So you've chosen a good screening, assessment, and progress monitoring system. You're collecting and using the data, sort of kind of step one. But the other two things that I think are low-hanging fruit that you can do are start to address that problem, right? So how can you actually address instruction in tier one in a way where almost all students are in tier one for all or most of their school day. And so it's really a high leverage position to be in to address that tier one instruction and make it better so that it's accessible for all students, so that you're not trying then to provide intervention to 50, 60, 70% of the population that your data are showing now are not responding to it, are not meeting or aren't on track to meet grade level objectives based on your screening data. So I guess those are the two most important. But if you can't do either one of those things, then definitely making sure that you're implementing evidence-based interventions for kids would be the third. Great. Okay, so I'm gonna transition now and talking to what literacy instruction should look like across tiers, informed by research evidence. So what and how do we teach literacy in these multi-tiered systems of support? Well, another big point on this, it should have been evident based on one of my last few slides talking about all of these other things that are part of MTSS, is that MTSS is an approach to service delivery. It does not tell you specifically what or how to teach. And that's a misnomer I hear a lot. Like, oh yeah, we're doing RTI. Our RTI kids are our RTI program. Though none of those things are, that's not accurate terminology. So MTSS is your umbrella. It's how how your system is designed to set up and designed to function. And then you're making choices within that umbrella about how different things are going to be implemented. And we want you to rely on evidence to make those choices. And that is going to tell us what and how to teach within the system. So the science of reading is sort of our evidence base for informing literacy and in the context of MTSS. It's a very vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. So it's not one specific thing. There are many things we still don't know, but even in that context, we do know a lot about how reading develops, that it's not a natural process. So it is something that needs to be directly and explicitly taught to students, unlike, say, language, which is naturally developed. And we know a lot about how and what to teach in order to support reading proficiency. We say that we need to focus on teaching the science of reading, or relying on the science of reading to inform our instruction as a social justice issue, to make sure that we're promoting equity in education. A couple predominant theories that support the science of reading and sort of the way we think about how we should design instruction, intervention, assessment, et cetera, within MTSS are Scarborough's reading rope from 2001, which talks about sort of the interrelated relationship between skills and how they're woven together across time to support skilled reading, involving the interaction between language comprehension and word recognition, which is not unlike the simple view formula of Gowan-Tunmer from 1986 that talks about decoding and language comprehension having a multiplicative effect for equating reading comprehension. So in the absence of decoding, reading comprehension will not be strong. In the absence of language comprehension, reading comprehension is unlikely to be strong. And so we really need to support both of those skills. the development of those skills in our instruction. When we talk about what to teach, particularly when we're talking about students with or at risk for disabilities, we really want to focus on the big ideas of instruction. And these big ideas have been established based on numerous studies over time. The National Reading Panel in 2000 screened more than 116,000 research articles published prior to 1998, which I realize was a while ago now. Still, findings since that time have not negated anything that has been established in the National Reading Panel report. What they found and identified, so what are the essential skills, what are the critical things that kids need to know in order to become proficient readers? And we call these the big ideas. And the reason that we focus on those big ideas is because, particularly when we're talking about limited resources or insufficient time, when we're thinking about students with disabilities who are often behind their peers by definition in these areas of literacy development, we need to focus on those things that are most essential because there's not enough time to teach them everything that they might have missed. And so we really have to be thoughtful about our approach and make sure that we're being efficient. So the 5 big ideas of reading are not going to shock anyone here, I would guess. We're talking about phonemic awareness as a sort of underneath phonological awareness, alphabetic principle, accuracy and fluency with connected text, vocabulary, and comprehension, where phonemic awareness is really separate from print. So it's the ability to hear and manipulate sounds in spoken words and understand that words are made of speech sounds before students really are seeing that connection to print. Then alphabetic principle is the focus of connecting those letters, those sounds to letters to form words for reading and writing. Accuracy is being able to read correctly. Fluency is reading those words with sufficient pace to aid other skills like comprehension. Vocabulary is something that is very language driven, but is very important for reading and supporting comprehension as well. And then comprehension is the intentional focus of gaining meaning from what it is that we read. And so we talk about these 5 big ideas as being those critical skills that we need to make sure that all instruction is focused on at minimum when we're talking in particular about core reading instruction for all students. In the early grades, kindergarten through 3rd grade, we see a shifting focus of these skills, assuming typical development, where there's a very heavy focus on phonological awareness and alphabetic principle. In kindergarten, the focus on phonological awareness fades very quickly. And so phonological awareness is not something that we're continuing to teach in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade for typically developing children, but even students with disabilities often. For alphabetic principle, the focus really starts on those individual letter sounds and combinations early on in schooling, going toward multisyllabic decoding, starting middle of 1st grade, moving into 2nd and 3rd grade. Automaticity and fluency with the code or accurate and fluent reading starts as soon as students are able to decode words and really ramps up across time. And vocabulary and comprehension really have a strong focus on listening skills early on because students are not independently accessing text. And as soon as they can independently access text, that starts to shift toward them gleaning meaning from text based on their own reading. So the shift is really important, and also recognizing that all of these skills have a role over time, where some of them are more important at certain time points than others. So that way, I was just talking about what to teach, the content of what it is that we're teaching. And now we're going to talk about how to teach. And again, we want evidence-based practices to really drive what instruction should look like. Again, the reason that we're focused on evidence-based practices is because there are often limited resources to teach and support students. So the school day is finite. We don't have hours and hours a day to teach students literacy. And so we can't just do whatever we want to do. We really need to make sure that we're giving students the skills that are the most high leverage for them. All students deserve the best chance at developing the skills that we know are successful for success or are necessary for success in school and life. So If students can't read, their ability to be successful in other disciplines is limited. Their ability to, as we move further down the road, we know that trajectories for students who are readers early on and those who are non-readers tend to widen. The gaps widen over time compared to narrowing, and we don't want to see that happen. That's just going to get students further and further behind, which is counter to what we want. Also a note on what evidence-based practices are, which is that they are practices that have been rigorously evaluated, often in randomized control trials. So we're comparing students that are getting some sort of treatment using a practice to students that are getting treatment using another practice or sort of business as usual practice. And then we compare their outcomes and we say which students are doing better. Those students that are, those treatments that we say are evidence-based are the ones that those students who were receiving those treatments far and above out improved the students in the other condition. And so those are those evidence-based practices that we really want to adhere to. I mentioned before, we don't have rigorous research evidence for every single thing, but we always want to make sure that we're using the most rigorous research evidence available to inform our practice and using that as a starting point for our instruction. There are sometimes critiques of evidence-based practices as not being locally relevant or taking into account the context and culture of a particular environment. And those are well heard. As researchers, we have an obligation to make sure that we are testing our practices or our interventions in varied samples with varied populations in different environments to make sure that we're controlling and guarding against that, and that we're replicating results across time so that we can make sure that those practices are truly effective. And then also using evidence-based practices as a starting point means that's where you start. And so if you do end up making adjustments from there because that is what is truly locally necessary, that's okay. But we can't disregard them entirely. When we're trying to look for evidence-based practices and figure out where they are, or how do we know what actually to do, there are a lot in the last 20 years, since probably the early 2000s. In 2002, the U.S. Department of Education founded the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. And their whole goal across the last 20 years has been trying to accrue research in education, evidence in education. And they have come up with a set of practice guides that they started releasing in 2006 that are focused on particular topics. And these practice guides are really geared toward practitioners to make sure that research can be digestible and implemented well. There are about 27 practice guides to date focused on a range of different topics. These practice guides are guided by an expert panel, and they review research evidence on a particular topic that's been identified as being of high interest, of high need to the field. And there are all kinds of different things. There's a practice guide on database decision-making and school dropout prevention. There are numerous practice guides on math and literacy, some on algebra, some on fractions, some on school systems and MTSS. So they really are a good source for evidence, among other places like the National Center on Intensive Intervention or other sites, websites or databases that are attempting to do similar things, the Warworks Clearinghouse, to accrue evidence and to communicate it to audiences. I'm hovering here on the IES practice guide for response to intervention for reading in the primary grades, because it outlays 5 specific recommendations based on the research that was reviewed by the panel for implementing RTI in elementary school. And they talk about the recommendation for screening. So screening all students for potential reading problems at the beginning of the year and again in the middle of the year, and then regularly monitoring progress of students for developing reading disabilities. And they say that there's a moderate level of evidence for this, which means there's generally positive evidence, but it's not the strongest level of evidence. But based on all of the data to date, they say that this is one of the most important practices you can implement in the context of RTI. Within Tier 1, they talk about providing differentiated reading instruction for all students based on assessments of student current reading level. They assigned this practice a low level of evidence, which doesn't mean it's not a good practice or it's not as important as the other practices, but it does mean based on the studies that are available to date, we have less evidence that that is an effective practice. probably because it's harder to study than some of the other practices. Still, though, based on sort of expert opinion, there's consensus that this is a good idea in education. Within tier 2 intervention, they identified 2 additional practices that are important. So providing intensive systematic instruction on up to 3 foundational reading skills in small groups to students scoring below the benchmark on universal screening, talking about how they meet, providing explicit instruction to these students was identified as having a strong level of evidence. And this really truly is probably what we consistently see as one of the strongest recommendations for MTSS research and RTI systems, which is the notion that students who are not responding to instruction, we hope it's very good, high quality, evidence-informed tier 1 reading instruction, but students who are not responding to that instruction should get small group daily or at least several times weekly for numerous minutes, evidence-based systematic reading intervention using explicit instruction. That's just one of the strongest recommendations. And then there are a couple of other recommendations here that have a low level of evidence, monitoring progress in tier 2, and then intensifying interventions for students in tier 3 within these systems. I'm hovering on this strong recommendation, however, because I want to unpack this because it has so much leverage within the context of tier 1 in addition to tier 2. So when we talk about what explicit and systematic instruction is, we're not talking about some of the potential negative connotations that may have been heard about explicit and systematic instruction, like it's drill and kill or anything like that. We're not talking about taking the joy out of reading. We're talking about making sure that all students know what is expected, that they know what the rules of literacy are, the rules of reading are, and that they can practice them and get feedback so that they can master these skills, so that they can do all of the other things that we want them to be doing with reading, so that they can read independently, so that they can really dive into what they're doing. So when we talk about explicit instruction, we talk about involving teacher explanations of what the learning target is, what they're going to be doing, teachers modeling what effective practice is or what it looks like to be an expert reader, providing practice opportunities for all students. So often there's in whole group instruction which is what tier 1 often looks like. There's the use of a signal to get students responding together, that there is judicious review. So there's review distributed over time and it's strategic, that there's appropriate pacing to keep students engaged in instruction and make sure that they're getting more practice opportunities, that there's immediate feedback provided to them to correct any potential misconceptions. And when we're talking about what the letter sound correspondence is for, the sound is for a particular letter, there's a right or wrong answer. It's not something that is questionable. And so we want to make sure students aren't practicing things the wrong way so that they're not committing those mistakes to memory and then not able to access the correct letter sound when they're reading to actually read the word correctly. That we incorporate checks for understanding to ensure that all students are understanding the content. And then when we're talking about systematic instruction, we're really talking about breaking activities into small steps, making sure that those steps are sequential over time, that they progress from simple to more complex, and that we make sure that students have the prior knowledge and prerequisite skills that they need prior to moving on through to new skills. That's not to say that we're going to focus only on phonemic awareness and then move to alphabetic principle, and then move to reading accurately and fluently, then to vocabulary, then to comprehension. We want all of those things to be taught. But within each of those skill levels, there are some skills that are more advanced than, or within all of those big ideas, there are some skills that are more advanced and skills that are less advanced. And we want to make sure that students have the prior knowledge they need to access a subsequent skill to support their success. So when we design this in MTSS, what this graphic depicts sort of how students might fall and sort of what we would expect to see in a healthy MTSS system, where tier 1 instruction for, again, all students is a 90-minute core block that focuses on using whole group instruction and differentiated small groups within that 90-minute block. So it might be divided, for example, into 30 minutes of reading instruction focused on those sort of foundational reading skills like phonics, phonemic awareness, reading accurately and fluently, 30 minutes that's focused on vocabulary and comprehension development and other literacy elements, and then 30 minutes of differentiated small group time so that small groups can work with the teacher or do different activities that they need based on what their individual skill levels are. And then again, for those students who maybe on the basis of screening data like DIBELS 8th edition, DIBELS tells us that which students are at risk for not meeting grade level expectations at the end of the year. We're going to use those risk levels to determine who needs this supplemental tier 2 intervention. They get 30-minute daily small group interventions. Ideally, those interventions are aligned with their tier 1 support, and the model that I'm going to talk to you about will provide an example of that. And then for students that are really behind or again haven't responded to both tier 1 and tier 2, those students are getting tier 3. This is an area of research that I am interested in exploring. Actually, it's an unanswered question. Should tier 3 be additive? So students should be getting tier 1 plus tier 2 plus tier 3, or should tier 3 supplant tier 2? There are feasibility questions related to that, what can actually work in schools, and there are also some efficacy questions, what's most effective for students. So that's something I'm actively exploring in my research right now. But in general, this is what we want our systems to look like. So again, just sort of summarizing what those tiers of support look like, we call tier 1 our universal support. It's designed for all students. We use screening assessments within this tier to determine who needs ongoing comprehensive core support to be on track to meet grade level objectives. And noting that Brookline is using DIBELS 8th edition, I was the professional development and lead for the DIBELS 8th edition content. I worked at University of Oregon. DIBELS 8th edition was created in my office. This is when we're talking about screening, when those students that are determined to be at benchmark are not students that don't need anything. Those students still need high quality. Those assumptions about students being on track are predicated on the fact that students are going to get high quality comprehensive literacy instruction in tier 1 to meet those end of grade level benchmarks. That's also why we rescreen, quote unquote, or progress monitor in winter and spring to make sure those students haven't fallen further behind, that they're still getting what they need in that tier 1 support and don't need something additional. Also within tier 1, we're using our high quality curriculum materials that teach all 5 big ideas. We're using explicit and systematic instruction because we know that 60% of students need explicit and systematic reading instruction in order to become proficient readers. We use data to differentiate instruction, and then we use other data sources, like I was just talking about with the benchmark data, to inform whether or not that tier of support is working. Tier 2, our targeted support, we're using evidence-based intervention programs that target all or a subset of the big ideas, and that instruction is delivered with fidelity. Typically in the early grades, because of the importance of ensuring that all students can decode, knowing that the gap between students who can read and cannot read is much smaller early on. We want to get all students decoding pretty quickly. Typically those interventions are focused on phonics and decoding in the early grades. And when we're talking about dyslexia, which is a word level reading disability, for that population in particular, we're going to be focusing on phonics and decoding interventions. We use high leverage explicit instructional practices, and we use progress monitoring and mastery data to guide instructional adjustments. And then in tier 3, this is our more intensive support. We want to make sure that we're not just thinking about providing more time to students, not necessarily even using a different intervention program, but we're making sure that we're being continuously intentional about the alignment of the instructional focus of the intervention program and student need, guided by data. There's more frequent progress monitoring and collection of mastery data because the support is more intensive, and we're intensifying that support using what we know about intensification, which does include things like aligning academic instruction with learner needs, integrating strategies that support cognitive processes like self-regulation and memory, differentiating instruction by making it even more explicit, increasing instructional time, and reducing group size. We have a framework through the National Center on Improving Literacy that sort of capitalizes on some of these areas of intensification, where we think about reading content, cognitive processing, instructional design, and instructional delivery. as being 4 different ways that we can really change what we're doing within instructional time to intensify instruction that go above and beyond just adding time. Another resource that I mentioned earlier related to just identifying evidence-based practices specifically is the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and they also have some resources related to thinking about intervention intensity and how you can intensify instructional support for students within tiers of support. So I'm going to pause there again before I go into a case example on ECRI, which is Enhanced Core Reading Instruction. I have laid out now at this point sort of what MTSS is and should be, what literacy tiers of instruction should look like in terms of how we should teach and what we should teach. So those big ideas and using explicit instruction and differentiating instruction, using data to inform our instruction, et cetera. Pausing there again to see if there are additional questions before we move on.
I have a question of who is implementing instruction at each level.
Oh, yeah, great question. Yeah, and going back to your earlier question, Ola, I think one of the obstacles that happens that comes up a lot in school settings is if there hasn't been someone dedicated to provide intervention, teachers are often trying to deliver those interventions. And I think for intensive intervention or for students with substantive needs, ensuring that someone has a high level of training to be able to provide that support is critical. But we've found in our research that instructional assistants can be trained to deliver effective instructional practices and work with teachers who are delivering tier 1 instruction. So teachers are classroom teachers, general education teachers are almost always delivering tier 1 instruction. Sometimes special education teachers are delivering tier 3 instruction. I'd say that's probably more common than not, or specialists are delivering tier 3 intervention. Tier 2 is sort of all over the board. And I would strongly recommend that school districts think about resources available within their system that include leveraging instructional assistants to deliver tier 2 so that teachers can focus on the other things that they really need to be focused on because they have so much on their plates already.
I have a question about the role of child study teams in this whole system, because that's something that's come up in Brookline as they're looking at it, and also just a little bit more clarification on, you mentioned that some schools use use the RTI or MTSS as a way to determine eligibility for special education, but then also that you mentioned that special education can occur at all within all tiers.
Right.
So if you could just clarify that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so MTSS and the underpinnings of MTSS really come from the public health system literature. So starting in like the late 20th century, talking about sort of tiered systems of support where we, on the public health side, we use tiered we use screening assessments all the time, and we have interventions that we use that are the increase in intensity across the board in a very effective way, I would say in most cases. We've essentially taken that model and applied it to an educational framework where the early underpinnings within education were a response to intervention, which was a system initially that was focused on implementing academic interventions, or like the school-wide reading model, focused on how we can support students who are falling behind after they're getting their regular reading instruction, but they're still not meeting those reading goals that we have for them. What can we do for them to make sure that they can meet those goals? At the same time that all of that work was going on in reading, there was work going on in behavior with positive behavior and intervention supports to develop also a multi-tiered system. And over time, probably between 2000 and 2010, those systems kind of merged from RTI and PBIS to MTSS as a broad framework for how we can think about delivering tiered systems of support where we gradually increase the intensity of support for students based on data indicating that they need supplemental support. So that's one purpose of RTI as sort of an academic focused MTSS system. At the same time, in the 2000s, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act came out with a revision in 2004 and identified that RTI as an approach is a valid approach for determining whether or not students are eligible for special education. And it requires that there's the implementation of evidence-based instruction and intervention, that there's the collection of data over time, indicating that students are falling behind, that there are efforts made to intensify instruction and support for them. People are again reviewing those data, and then ultimately if it's deemed that students can't benefit sufficiently from general education, that they really need specially designed instruction, then they're determined to be eligible for special education under the category of specific learning disability. So RTI then, distinct from PBIS, has two different purposes. One is sort of this purpose of providing the instruction and intervention supports that all students need to meet the academic learning goals that they have. And then for RTI, the second is this SLD eligibility framework. They're not different things though. In order for RTI, for SLD eligibility decisions to be an effective approach, RTI as the academic system has to be implemented effectively. So we have to be implementing that high quality tier 1 instruction. We have to be implementing those effective tier 2 interventions. We have to be collecting data using technically adequate screening and progress monitoring assessments, and using those data in teams who are reviewing those data regularly, which is what I would say child study teams should be doing. So those often schools call these all different things. Sometimes they're MTSS data teams, sometimes they're student study teams, all different things. But the idea is that there is a team regularly meeting, probably at least monthly, to look at data and say, okay, we're looking at at the beginning of the year, we're looking at our screening data. We're assigning students to tiers of support based on our initial data. We're progress monitoring for those students who are getting tier 2 or tier 3 interventions. We're meeting and we're reviewing those data and saying, this is working or this isn't. We need to adjust their intensity of support. For students in tier 3, there might be others that are involved in making additional, or even in tier 2, I suppose, others that are involved in making interim adjustments to their support also. As if I'm their instructor, I'm looking at their data on a regular basis and saying, what I taught them yesterday wasn't working, so I need to go back and I need to tweak this or provide them with more practice on this. That's what I would call like a small adjustment compared to a child study team. It's really going to be looking at groups of data to say whether or not the instructional group is effective as a whole, whether the intensity is sufficient as a whole. How do we adjust from there? Miriam, I don't know, I hope that answered the question. I think I answered multiple parts. Let me know if I left something out.
Yes, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
So Nancy, so if a parent, so in our district, as you mentioned, we are being, the teachers are administering dibbles at the beginning of the year and end of the year. And so what should a parent expect, or like, I guess, how can a parent sort of know what's next? So let's say the first time point their child is considered at risk, like what's next for them? What should they ask for from the school in terms of helping their child?
Yeah, I would say it's a two-way street, and it's really tricky, I think, for parents because sometimes they're not getting enough information to know what it is to ask for. I think as a school system, we have an obligation to provide information to parents about what the data mean. And so if we're collecting screening data and communicating that to parents, we want to tell them what their scores mean. So if a student is at benchmark or below benchmark, so they're at some risk or they're at risk, what does that mean? And then not only what does that mean, because if you just tell them what it means and you leave it there, I as a parent sort of freak out and be like, okay, so well, what do I do now, right? How do I address this? So communicating what the plan is then for that student. So, okay, my child is not at risk, they're at benchmark, where your child will continue with the district plan for literacy, which is X, Y, and Z. Great. Your child is at some risk on this assessment, which means that we think your child would benefit from supplemental intervention. They're going to continue to get this great support that we're providing in tier 1, but we're also going to provide them with this support at this time of day for this long using this program because we're worried about these areas of skill development. We'll give you additional data over time to make sure that you know how well that's working and how we're adjusting. And then, it's sort of a similar package for students in tier 3, but it's more intensive, right? And I think that needs to be a very early conversation. Those things need to be communicated very early on so that it's not the first time a parent is hearing is when we're talking about special education eligibility, which too often, as a former special education teacher, too often that is what happens. But I think that frees up parents, then it sort of empowers parents to know more about what to ask for, because they have a little bit more information about what is already happening.
And so, because one of the things that came up in the discussions on our screener is that, this first time point doesn't really mean anything. A child could have had like a bad day. And so like knowing the DIBELS data, as in, like at what point is performing below benchmark on DIBELS is a meaning, is it at the first point, is it 2 points? Yeah.
So DIBELS 8th edition was normed on tens of thousands of students across the country, and I guarantee you a reasonable proportion of them are having a bad day. So I would also take that into account when you're thinking about whether or not the data point is valid for a student who's having a rough day. That said, I do realize that sometimes it does not seem like a specific score is representative of a child's actual ability, in which case you should always use other data sources to inform whether or not they should get an intervention. So if a student is like, you truly know because you have other similar data sources that show you that a child is a fluent reader and they get a 0 on a DIBELS screening assessment for oral reading fluency, which is the same task, right? Reading fluently, then you'd say, okay, something is up with this. I'm not convinced that they need supplemental intervention. Maybe I'll hold off on parent notification, but I'm going to gather more data so that I can make that informed decision. That's counter a little bit to what I would say if you think based on your curriculum, which may or may not be aligned with the focus of delivering explicit systematic phonics instruction, that this child's a fluent reader, their NWF, their nonsense word fluency score is 0, telling me that they can't identify any correct letter sounds within a word. I know that they don't need reading intervention. That would not be okay in my book, because you're not comparing apples and apples in that case. You're comparing apples and oranges, and you need to make sure that you're really, really confident if you're not going to follow a score that has as much evidence behind it for making those decisions. And again, these aren't hard and fast decisions. They're not intended to be high stakes in this MTSS system. So we really do want students to be able to move flexibly, but we do recognize there is local context, and there are other factors that you want to consider as you're moving forward.
So it sounds like, just to kind of summarize, what I'm hearing is that it's always important to communicate child performance to the parents, especially if a child is at risk. Yeah. And it's always, and being below benchmark on DIBELS or any really like valid screener should never be dismissed, but always looked more deeply into trying to figure out, if there's a discrepancy between what is seen in the classroom, especially if there is a discrepancy, that's definitely something else needs to happen.
Absolutely. And the other note on the high stakes versus non-high stakes, I think so too often the only time parents are hearing from us as educators is when something is really awful, that there is sort of this automatic reaction on both sides. Like, how do I, as a teacher, how do I communicate effectively to this parent that this isn't like, this isn't breaking the bank, like this isn't the be all end all, but this is something I want them to know about as one piece of data that we're considering to make sure that we're providing the instruction and support that the student needs. So we're not talking about special education right now. We're talking about prevention, early intervention, making sure that our instruction is better for the student, and that is all. But we want parents to know what the instruction is. I was talking to a friend from college earlier today who lives in an affluent Portland suburb, and both of her children are sort of not doing well in the area of reading. And I was asking her, I was like, so what does instruction look like? Do you know what the core program is? Do you know what interventions they use? And she's like, I don't. And then she texted me afterward and sent me this Facebook post where there's been this analysis of programs that are being used in Oregon districts. And so many of the affluent districts are using programs that we know have no evidence behind them and are not teaching phonics. And I was like, yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, we want to make sure that parents who are informed with that information can advocate for the things that we all want them we want their children to get. We want them, we all want kids to be able to read. So it's figuring out how to do that together. All right, I'm gonna go quickly through an example of just sort of how these principles can fit together in a system. This example is it's a program called Enhanced Core Reading Instruction that was developed at the University of Oregon, stemming from Reading First. So large initiative under the Bush administration. We all know Oregon's the Oregon Reading First Technical Assistance Center was part of it was nested within the Western Regional Center that was housed at the Center on Teaching and Learning, which also is where Dibble's 8th edition comes from. And the reason that we developed ECRI was really that based on the work in Reading First, we found that teachers had access to these core programs. So they were being mandated to use these comprehensive core programs under Reading First, but had a really difficult time using them and making them as explicit as students needed in order for their instruction to be effective. And so we wanted to come up with ways to make that easier and more effective. So the enhanced core reading approach is an evidence-based MTSSR approach, and that it's been validated in several studies that I'll describe to you. But it involves screening students and assigning them to tiers of support, using progress monitoring, mastery data to differentiate and adjust the levels of support in those child study teams over time. So at the beginning of the year and monthly and quarterly, and at the end of the year. There's professional development and coaching that supports teachers teachers and teams and school leaders to use data to improve their instruction, not in high stakes ways. We're talking about using these data very formatively, having coaches go in and model for teachers how they can use a particular practice more effectively, really intended to be supportive. Tier 1 focuses on prioritizing the content of instruction from the core program and using teaching routines that increase the quality of explicit instruction. And then in Tier 2, students that are identified as needing that support on the basis of early screening data get this highly aligned approach that is delivered to students as a pre-teach. So what often happens in schools, and it totally makes sense, like we screen and then students get intervention. We provide instruction and then students get intervention. It kind of flips it on its head. It says, okay, we know that if all students are getting this core instruction and some students are going to get intervention, how can we support this core instruction to be more effective for those students who need intervention? Well, we can use similar strategies and approaches. We can follow the same scope and sequence. And we can make sure that our Tier 2 instruction is delivered as a pre-teach for students. So if I'm a student getting Tier 2 small group intervention, I go to my small group intervention. I see the same practice opportunities with the critical core content, and then I go into my Tier 1 whole class instruction later the same day or the next day. And I already know it. I've already had exposure to it. And so instead of being the student who's like, I'm confused, I'm behind, now I go to a small group and someone's going to fix it for me, I come into Tier 1 with a leg up and I'm able to be more successful and benefit from what Tier 1 looks like. So that's really what we've tried to focus on with ECRI here. And so it's really based on this idea of using a multi-tiered approach, like response to intervention, knowing that that's really only valid if we're providing effective Tier 1 and Tier 2 intervention. We can't assume that that is the case based on what we've seen and what we know about school instruction and intervention, unfortunately, that early intervention is critical for preventing ongoing reading difficulty, that we need to make sure that Tier 1 is really accessible to all students, particularly students with or at risk for disabilities, and that we know that explicit and systematic instruction is highly effective for teaching all students to read, again, especially for students with or at risk for disabilities, including dyslexia. So I laid out what ECRI was, but it is using this screening and progress monitoring and mastery data, increasing the explicitness and intensity of instruction, making sure there's differentiation, increasing alignment and cohesion, increasing specificity, which is sometimes frowned upon in instruction, sort of this idea of providing teachers with a routine or sort of a semi-script of things that they can say. we do this for these 5 big ideas to make sure that we free up teachers' time to focus on the things that are really important. We know that core programs are not making instruction explicit enough. And so if we use these routines that give teachers the tools to make instruction more explicit, they can focus on other aspects of their classroom. And we know right now, especially post-pandemic, students are coming to school with a lot of needs. And so we want to make sure that teachers are able to attend to those needs and not having to spend every night lesson planning for the next day to make their program more explicit. We use professional development and coaching, and then we monitor implementation, which is another part of MTSS that's I haven't mentioned so far, but really thinking about these systems. And as we're thinking about whether or not they're working, we're using student data to tell us whether or not students are learning. We're making adjustments to our instruction. But too often, I think we sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, for lack of a better metaphor, where we say, okay, we've been doing this for 2 years, it's not working, let's get a whole new program. But we don't actually even know whether or not that program is delivered with fidelity. Were people actually doing it? Were they doing it the way it was supposed to be delivered? So if we've adopted an evidence-based program or practice, we want to make sure it's actually being delivered as it's designed to be delivered, so that we aren't making decisions that are ill-informed. So there are multiple studies of ECRI. There was an initial efficacy trial that was between 2008 and 2013, and multiple studies came out of that efficacy trial demonstrating that at-risk readers in first grade were able, and that received the ECRI MTSSR approach, outperformed students that did not receive that ECRI MTSSR approach. So it's essentially comparing ECRI MTSSR to district business as usual MTSSR, using the same core program, business as usual, professional development coaching, same assessments. It was just that the ECRI approach was layered on in the treatment schools. We also found that ECRI could increase the teachers' the quality of explicit instruction they provided, and how frequently they were providing practice to students. And we found that ECRI supported students who were just receiving that, who were receiving tier 1 plus tier 2, compared to students who are receiving just tier 1. It supported those students that needed that tier 2 to catch up to those students that just needed tier 1. There have also been some independent reviews of ECRI. So it's been reviewed by some of these websites that I've mentioned that are independent review sites that are excellent sources for research evidence, like the National Center on Intensive Intervention, Evidence for ESSA. There's another Institute of Education Sciences funded effectiveness trial right now intending to replicate the efficacy trial findings that we found previously in different districts with different populations for those reasons that I mentioned earlier. It's also part, I don't know if I'll have time to say this, it's also part of a national evaluation of MTSS that's going on right now. About 3 years ago, the Institute of Education Sciences commissioned, because of concern about the level of evidence for response to intervention in MTSS that had been established in the field, and because of some probably misinformation and misconceptions in the field, IES decided that they really wanted to study this in earnest. And so they've commissioned this very large evaluation that is comparing ultimately ECRI MTSSR compared to another MTSSR treatment condition, compared to business as usual MTSSR in 160 schools across the US. And it's a mix of rural and urban districts in every region. So we're part of that, and we're working to support sort of an evaluation of what it can look like to implement MTSSR when you're using effective practices. I'm cognizant of time. I think I'll just hover on a couple of additional points, and then we can pause for more questions. That this approach, again, was really intended to take something that schools and districts already had access to and make it better, because we knew that it wasn't good enough as it was. And so we did that by focusing on the how and the what of teaching. So that is sort of prioritizing the content, the 5 big ideas of literacy instruction, and then adding explicit instructional enhancements, which are our ECRI teaching routines. And those teaching routines focused on all of the things that you would think would be nested within the 5 big ideas, like irregular word reading, phonemic awareness, sound spelling, blending sounds, regular word reading, reading connected text fluency, encoding practice, so mapping the sounds back to print, vocabulary and comprehension in a way that was very systematic for students. We came up with these routines that were really, these maps were really were intended to say to work with each core program that districts had adopted or have adopted, where we'd say, okay, your core program says do this activity. We say that's fine, but use this routine and add these practice opportunities because there was insufficient practice as it is in the program. This activity that's talking about like cutting out letters, don't worry about that one. That's not like spending 30 minutes doing that is not going to be the best way to teach your students literacy skills. This next one is great, but use these additional practice opportunities again because there isn't enough practice built in. So it was going through every core program and coming up with a map to tell teachers of what they needed to do. And ultimately we created tier 2 lessons that were aligned with that, and now have just worked with teachers to supplant those within their program. And so the tier 2 lessons are taught small group in our tier 2 groups, and they're taught whole group in tier 1 instruction. So they use the same teacher cueing, the same practice opportunities, again, the same feedback, so that those tier 2 students see that alignment and can be more successful across tiers. And then going to tier 2, I guess I should say, I mean, part of this is that it doesn't really require, if you have a core program, it doesn't require anything additional aside from the program materials themselves, because it's intended to work with what schools are already doing, so that it's not something so disparate. It's something that really can align with the system itself. And in tier 2, you see the same activities. The lessons are broken up. They're intended to be 30-minute lessons and daily. So that's not, I mean, I guess it's sort of a plug for ECRI, but not really. That wasn't the intent. It's really just to provide an example of how you can take these principles of MTSS and embed them within your instruction in a way to make instruction more explicit and think about what students need across those tiers of support. So also, yeah, I'm going to stop there. I've got a couple of additional resources that I can share. So other questions, or things that people are struggling with or thinking about, I'd love to chat more.
I have a question. I know that one of the misconceptions is that sort of phonics-oriented instructional approaches, and you mentioned that as well, are boring and just kind of like very unstimulating for children, and also that the whole language proponents say that sort of language kind of approaches are more needed to support the comprehension skills development.
Sure.
And so if you could speak a little bit of like what kind of comprehension supporting strategies are used, like in a classroom for ECRI, for example.
Yeah, I think I had a slide and I probably got rid of it, but so the way that I mentioned that in the efficacy trial, we used these lesson maps to, let me see if I can move this. We use these lesson maps that told teachers what to do, and then there were routines that they could use. I know that it's way too small for you to actually see on this slide, but essentially you'd get to a comprehension activity and we would say, use routine card number 15. And it would be a routine card that would talk about the ways that they could structure the comprehension activity to meet the objective. So maybe it's about predicting what's going to happen in a text. And so there's a graphic organizer that's talking about like before, during, and after text. And it guides the teacher to work with students to look at maybe the cover of the book and the title and have a discussion about like, okay, this is a before reading activity. What do we think this text is going to be about? What are the things that we can use to inform instruction? And it was giving teachers sort of like, it's almost like sentence starters, right? For working with students to be able to have those discussions in ways that were going to be more explicit for them. We continue to have those routines as part of ECRI, but because of the nature of vocabulary and comprehension instruction, it is very open-ended. You don't know what students are going to say or what there's no right or wrong answer in a lot of cases. And so it's more difficult to systematize that in the same way we've been able to do with the foundational reading skills instruction. And that's not because it's less important, it's just different, right? So we continue to use those routines as ways of working with teachers to make, and professional development and coaching, to work with teachers to make that instruction more explicit so that students are making those connections that we know are equally important to decoding. I think the problem, if we go the other way, if we go toward an approach that is teaching students only about text structure and the sort of the having discussion, maybe very rich discussions about the content of a text, but never actually requiring students to independently access that text, is that it just gets harder for students to learn that skill as they grow older, in part because of our curriculum and our curriculum standards, right? We know after third grade that we're not focused on really spending any time at all teaching kids how to read what is in the text. And so if we don't spend that time early on, then we end up with a lot of kids in third grade who can't read. We're asking them to do all of these things that are taking them an immense amount of time, because the cognitive energy that it's requiring them to look at a word and figure out even what the word says doesn't necessarily fit with the strategies they've been taught. It's a mismatch. And so it would be a better use of our time to not disregard vocabulary and comprehension. I'm not saying that at all, obviously. We just want to make sure that the portion of our instruction that's focused on decoding in particular, that we're making sure that that is explicit and systematic and well intended for students. And using great vocabulary and comprehension strategies. There's plenty of students that need those to be explicit too. But using that in the way that makes sense within the context of our curriculum and our context to support students. What other questions do folks have?
I just want to say, people, feel free to unmute yourself if you have any
Please.
questions and just jump in. And in the meantime, I'll just ask
Yeah.
another question. I promise I'll give.
Yeah.
So I know that you're part of ANSEL, which is the National
Yeah.
Center for Literacy, and you've been working. So schools have been approaching you. We just talk about it, like what kind of requests you get from schools, and how do you work with schools that independently reach out to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. Yes, so the National Center on Improving Literacy was funded by the U.S. the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education in 2016, originally to the University of Oregon, but we competed for it at Boston University, and it is now at Boston University. And our primary mission is to support educators, parents and families, really anyone who's working with children pre-K through grade 12, to support their literacy outcomes with a focus on students who are at risk for not attaining full literacy skills due to a disability. And so that includes things like developing or distributing resources related to screening and instruction and intervention through our website or social media and other channels, webinars, et cetera, through professional development sessions that we have, and through technical assistance work, which we use a sort of a three-tiered approach to universal or to technical assistance, which is sort of universal technical assistance. That is a lot of these things that I'm talking about, like social media, website, very like broad distribution, intended to increase awareness about effective literacy practice, but not necessarily to change practice. Targeted technical assistance, which might be limited duration and focused on a particular topic, and people can actually come to our website and request technical assistance on a particular area, and then our team will identify a service provider who can work with you to provide to get that support. And then intensive technical assistance, which is really a relationship brokered through me at this point, but it's a way of working really closely with partners who are committed to changing practice in a particular area. And we bring to bear, all of these services are free. We bring to bear our staff or other experts to provide training and meet with you regularly, and really focus on the development of resources that will support your system, that also have the potential to benefit other stakeholders. So we might co-develop some things or learn from one another in the process, where we can develop resources that can again benefit other districts or other states, et cetera. So we've worked with the state of Maryland on universal screening in a sample district within their state. We've worked with the state of Idaho on shoring up their MTSS systems for general education practices. We've worked with the state of Pennsylvania on their SLD identification practices, the state of Michigan on intensive interventions. We work with Florida and their Department of Justice, Hawaii. We're working with Massachusetts sort of less formally right now, but have a couple of districts that we've been working with actually related specifically to disproportionality, identification, and special education. And that is, I know that's it's an important topic locally. So, and I just quick preview of what that content typically looks like is some increased awareness of some bias in assessments and how we can better use assessment practices, but also thinking about how students get referred in the first place. And a lot of that has to do with our MTSS systems and the quality of instruction we're providing. So we sort of have that lens as to how we focus on it. So plug for ENSEL, and I will go back and share my screen because that was the question. That there are all kinds of resources that I can point you to on our website. So National Center on Improving Literacy, our website is there, our Twitter feed, our Facebook feed, and then these are just some sample resources. But please do go there and you can check things out. While I have folks' attention before anyone asks another question, I also want to say that because I'm new to BU, another thing that is part of ENSEL work, but also just work getting acquainted with Massachusetts, there are all kinds of research opportunities that come up through projects that either I or my colleagues at our sort of new research center are running. And one of these is Chan Zuckerberg Foundation funded initiative that's focused on developing a more accurate early predictor screening assessment of literacy achievement. And so we're actually actively seeking schools to participate for the next 6 months in this project in districts like Brookline and Newton and other surrounding areas. So if you happen to be in the district and are interested in participating and think this would be a good opportunity, please do reach out to us. The idea of the assessment is to take into account factors of literacy development that aren't often considered in screening assessments in order to increase the accuracy of prediction of those assessments.
Just to say, if anyone is not comfortable to pose a question, you can just pose it in the chat and I'm happy to ask it for you. And in the meantime, I have another question. One of the things that we talked about disproportionality, and one of the things that you said that I think two things that you said about screening that's really, really important is that you sort of expect about 25% of students not to respond to general instruction. And some of the numbers that came up using APCAS in Brookline, for example, is that about only 30% of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, from underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds, and students with disabilities are reading at a proficient level. And so basically, if the general instructional district was robust, right, you would expect within those communities to also have 25%. Only 25% of students are not responding to general proficiency. That's giving it not intervention, right? And the other point that I think was very, very important that you mentioned, that screening in and of itself is really not meaningful if it's not in the context of an effective tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 instruction for multiple purposes. One is that we want to see that the child is not responding to an instruction, right? And that's sort of a hallmark of having a learning disability, is that you're not responding to an otherwise effective instruction. If your instruction is not effective, there's no way to tell why a student is not knowing how to read. And then another one, of course, is that, if you identify a child as having risk, but you're not helping them, then what is the point of identifying a child, or if you're not using that data to inform your instruction? So I just wanted to kind of emphasize, because I think those are important points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it exactly right. You can do one without the other, but I don't recommend it, right? I mean, if you're just collecting the data and you're looking at it, you're just admiring the problem. And if you're just delivering instruction and not looking at the data, then you don't really know whether or not what you're doing is working. So we need to have both in order to support students. And it really does go back, I think, to this early intervention sort of prevention idea too. I mean, we have summative assessment data always, right? By the time, when kids are in 3rd grade or moving forward, we have end of year assessments that tell us whether or not students are meeting benchmarks, but that's so distal, right? It's so not supportive in this formative context where we can use the data before students get to that summative data point to inform the way that we're working with them. And years of instruction are precious, right? I mean, we give kids 13 years of instruction in schools and expect them to be able to read within the first 4. So if they can't, then we have to make up time somewhere. Yeah, so ways to contact me. I'll put that in the chat. And Spencer, I see your note too about more information about the CZI project. So I will private message you about that.
Just one question kind of related to what you were just saying, Nancy, about older students. So, Brookline has just begun to, to screen K through 2. They'll probably add, 3rd grade. But, what about students in upper elementary, even middle school, and even high school who have kind of, gone along and maybe fallen through the cracks? How does an MTSS system, identify them, and what can be done, because it's so much harder, obviously.
Completely. I mean, we know less about it. And I'll be totally honest about that. I think there are some things that do translate relatively well. So our screening measures are not as robust in the upper grades, but we do have some that we can use to identify students. We have some interventions that we can use. The structures of the school day obviously look very different for students. And so that's a consideration for thinking about what instruction and intervention is going to look like. But my initial teaching experience was in middle and high school. And so my approach that I think still stands up was always to have a sort of dual focus on keeping students caught up on the grade level expectations that they're going to be required to meet, while also reserving some time for remediation and support. And so I think that becomes even more, I mean, it's always critical, but you have to be much more strategic about how you're doing that in the secondary grades for students. There are all kinds of like nuances, about that, related to the sort of the structure of these systems and the structure of how, say, supplemental or intensive intervention is provided, so that those systems can work a little bit more flexibly, that school systems have to play with as part of this. We did some work for over a period of 5 years with 6 different districts in Oregon evaluating their middle school MTSS systems. And I can say that the systems that had the most intensive supports are the ones that had the best outcomes for students that had been struggling, but it was difficult for them to provide. I mean, whereas in elementary school, when we're talking about tier 2 or supplemental interventions being 30 minutes a day, in some cases for middle school interventions, we were talking about intervention above and beyond what they were getting in their 45-minute ELA block or ELA class, being 90 minutes, daily 90 minutes of intervention. So that is not to say that it's not a valuable enterprise in secondary school, but that is why I spend a lot of time talking about prevention in early elementary school.
Can you talk about sort of under the ideal conditions, right? When you have been doing your research evaluating efficacy, what do student gains look like? Like, I guess if you could sort of translate it, like once the reading scores, and how does it compare to like normalizing the reading scores?
Sure. Yeah, so we've looked at, our outcomes have been on things like DIBELS and also standardized assessments like the SAT-10, and which is not the SAT test, it's the Stanford Achievement Test, 10th edition, and like the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test, for measures like word attack or word identification, where they're really decoding measures and students are having to approach words, either nonsense words or real words, and read them. The SAT-10 has multiple tests, and our findings related to closing the achievement gap have really been on that SAT-10 total reading measure. So it's sort of overall reading proficiency where students catch up. Our effect sizes have been anywhere between like 0.25 and 0.5, which means that students in the treatment group are either catching up or outperforming other students by a quarter to half of a standard deviation. And those standard deviations are often based on sort of like a year's worth of growth, for example. So it's basically saying that those students would be able to catch up in 2 years' time, or on average. So the effect sizes are meaningful when we start talking about what research and methodology says is meaningful. And I would guess, I mean, these are things that we need to study, but I would guess that they would potentially have sort of a ramping up effect or a multiplicative effect over time, where if students are gaining that much ground in a single year and we continue to intervene in a subsequent year, that we're seeing even more gain or even more proximity to their peers. So important, they're substantively and so significant in both the practical sense, but also in the statistical sense. When
Right.
that's sort of, I mean, that is there in the early grades, it's easier to get larger standard deviations and larger effect size, larger effect sizes than it is in later grades, which is why I was talking about that notion of how much time and effort and resource goes into catching students up. But I think sort of on, if you were to look at a lot of external sites about effective interventions, a lot of those that are effective have standard deviations or effect sizes that are around 0.2 or 0.25. So having something that's closer to 0.5 is actually is pretty meaningful.
Right, and I just wanted to say that those 2 years of being behind, it's sort of usually, right, like children with reading disabilities, for example, sort of maintain those like 2 years
Right.
behind throughout their education and never
Yeah.
quite catch up. And so
Yeah.
this is kind of like you mentioned, those single word decoding skills, but those have consequences for downstream comprehension, vocabulary, development, general knowledge, right? So all kinds of other really important skills, and then not only for ELA, but also for math and also for history and etc. So those are really, really meaningful. So if you catch those 2 years, if you like are able to sort of catch up in those early grades, then you're saving a child years of struggle and potentially like really changing their trajectory of outcomes.
Completely. And I know we need to wrap up, but the one thing I'll say too is very often I think people will start to see progress. And I've been in many schools where MTSS has been implemented well, and everyone's like, okay, we can relax now. It's all good. Everything's fine. And I hate to say it, but that is just not true. And so this is something that requires intentional, ongoing, sustained effort in order to achieve, but it's worth it in the end. And so I appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
We have we have, I guess, 1 minute. So just quickly pose a question that Athena asked in the chat, and that is, I don't know if you have any data on that, but do you have any data on full day versus part day kindergarten programs for literacy, I guess?
Not at my fingertips. I mean, Oregon happened to have half-day kindergarten until about 6 years ago. And that was when it became compensatory that there was full-day kindergarten. I think that there is impact, but I can look into that and follow up with Ola, who can share findings if that's something you'd like.
Thank you, thank you. First of all, please join me in thanking Dr. Nelson for this amazing presentation. And then please stay in touch. We will be sharing through our newsletter summary of this presentation as well as the video. And so, yeah, please be in touch with us. We have our email somewhere. Maybe somebody can quickly post it in the chat. And yeah, I don't know if Ben and Miriam, if you have anything to add.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson, so much. This was wonderful, and I hope that everybody enjoyed this and got a lot out of it, and I know that I did. And so thank you again, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us.
And I will echo that. Thank you so much. Great presentation, super interesting. Thank you for joining us, to everybody. I'm just putting our email, brooklineliteracy@gmail.com, in the chat. And yeah, very, very interesting. Lots to digest. So
Always.
Have a good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
thank you.